Welcome. Thank you so very much. And I'm delighted to be here. And what I want to try to accomplish over the next 2 hours, my background is in neuroscience, in the brain, and how the brain processes information. And what I want to try to do over the next 2 hours is to talk about what is it that we know about the brain, how the brain operates, and how can we actually use that information to do a better job delivering training that makes a difference. And so I think it should be interesting. Let me go to my next slide. As Alfonso mentioned, I've been working with Google, and it's worth taking just a minute to say what it's like there, because it will reflect on the kinds of remarks I'll be making the rest of the day. When you arrive at Google, the first thing is that they're all like 20-something, and they're all shiny, and they show up, and they walk in with a bag of laundry over their shoulder, of course, because they just drop it at the front because Google does your laundry for you. The barber shop pulls up, and you get your free haircuts, gourmet food 24/7. When you walk into my building, you walk through a room which is the world's largest disco. On an average weekend day, they'll have 110,000 people because it's a virtual disco. And as you walk through it, you see all of these vector-based people who are real human beings all dancing together, and you can go up and push the button and say, I only want to see people who speak German, and people will disappear, and other people will appear, and you can go up and talk to them in the virtual disco. It's not even something they market. It's just something that somebody thought of. And it's a real indication of the kind of almost irreverence that Google has toward all the things that they're doing. And the kids that I'm working with, and again, they're all in their 20s, these kids know the history of education. They know how we've done it in the past, and they don't defer to it. They say, how can we make it better? So it's not like they're ignoring it. They want to understand everything that's been done in the past, but how can we completely rethink the way we're doing this? And when you have a canvas like touching 1.2 billion people, when you have those kinds of opportunities, you should be thinking differently. And so I'm going to try to share with you some of the different things that we've been doing to try to change the way the world learns. Is this thing set, gentlemen? No. All right. So I'll kind of, all right. If you need slides, you don't really know what you're doing. All right. Professor. I'm going to be a professor here and not a consultant. So let's try to figure out, I've had a lot of experience in the CE world and the kinds of special challenges in the CE world and the complacency and so forth. So we do a lot of training for the legal profession and medical. So the nature of the compliance training, required training, how do we reach those kinds of audiences? How do we engage people like that? So what I would like to do is we're going to go, and I want to try to teach you the way the brain actually works. How does memory work? How does learning work? And you're going to be surprised because it's not going to work the way you think it does. So what I'm going to start with, we do a lot of things that are interactive. I need you to have some kind of a notepad or a paper, however you want to do it, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you a list of words, 15 words. I'm going to read them slowly. When I'm done, I'm going to need you to remember as many of those words as you can in any order. Use any mnemonic technique you want and so forth, but I'm going to read to you again a list of 15 words, and when I'm done reading that list, I'm going to ask you to recall them. Please don't write them down as I'm saying them. That's cheating. All right. Okay, so just relax and listen. You write them down when I'm done. The first word on the list is bulb. Bulb. Second word is feather. Feather. Third word is glare. Glare. Number 4 is bright. bright. 5 is calorie, calorie. Number 6, night, night. Number 7 is shade, shade. Number 8 is heavy, heavy. Number 9, day, day. Number 10 is switch, switch. '11 is thin, thin. 12 is diet, diet. 3 more. 13 is thunder, thunder. 14, fluorescent, fluorescent. Final word, cotton, cotton. Write down as many of those words as you can, please, in any order. All right, let's bring this together. What we want to do, for those of you who had an education class or a psychology class more than 5 years ago, you had a particular model of memory. There's a couple of you in here that might be the case for. You had a model of memory. And the old model talked about, well, there's an iconic memory. It's a very a brief memory. The stimulus comes in, it's processed by the prefrontal cortex. It's then pushed back into short-term memory. Short-term memory can hold about 7 items. It's rehearsed in short-term memory, pushed over to long-term memory. Cool, thank you. Cool, there's this classic model. If it's sufficiently rehearsed, the item then is passed over here into long-term memory. If it's insufficiently rehearsed, it's forgotten. This model makes certain kind of predictions about how your memory should work. For example, it predicts the first words on the list should be remembered. So let's see, the first word on the list, we should expect most people remember the first word was bulb. How many people have bulb on their list? Now, you remember that one because it went into the short-term memory, got extra rehearsal time. We should also predict the last word on the list because it was still in the short-term memory at the time of retrieval. So how many people remembered cotton? Again, almost everybody. Terrific. Words in the middle are somewhat less likely to be remembered. For example, how many people remembered the word switch? Half. How many people remembered the word light? Half. Keep your hands up. It's not on my list. Alfonso, this is a good group. This is a good group. They remember things that weren't even on the list. Something really important just happened. And in effect, I just implanted a memory. And I'll explain what we mean by implanting a memory. And it's kind of a clever, cute effect, but it's fundamental to the way memory actually works. And so I will try to explain to you how I did it and so forth. But then once you understand it, you're going to understand something very fundamental about the way the brain processes information. And then I hope the rest of the day to show you how do you leverage this kind of understanding to delivering significantly better training. And this is the kind of what I'll call brain-compatible training that we're doing at Google. And I think it's dramatically different and better. So what just happened? Let's start there. Okay, that's that. Which way should I point? Behind me. Ah, that worked. All right. When I read a word to you, what it really does is it activates structures in the brain, whole collections, networks of neurons. And it the primary activational area relates to the word itself. For example, the word switch gets activated in areas of the brain, but so too do all the associated terms. So all the connotations, for example, the forms of change, the verb forms to change or to modify. When you heard the word switch, those got stimulated a little. So too, if you were in the South, maybe a twig or a cow. Switch is the back of a cow's tail, right? Or getting a whooping. Maybe when you heard the word switch, that's what you thought of. But subtly, when you heard the word switch, the area of your brain corresponding to the word light got lightly stimulated. Not consciously, but it got stimulated a little. But then I kept going with the list. Trying. Maybe I'll just stay up there. All right. Each of the words, when you look at the list, each word on the list had as one of its associations, one of its connotations, the word light. Bulb, bright, cotton, diet. Each of those words had as one of its associations the word light. And so what I did in effect was I subtly stimulated the part of your brain associated with the word light 15 times. Now, what memory is, when recall, you like to think that you remember what actually happened. That's not the way memory seems to work. What memory seems to do is to go back, scan the brain, and say, hey, what's been stimulated a lot lately? What's been stimulated a lot? Oh, the word bulb, that was stimulated a lot. That must have, I remember that. I heard the word bulb. But you also go back and you scan through your brain, you say, oh, the word light, that's been stimulated a whole lot lately. And you remember it. In fact, if I were to defer the test, if I were to read you this list of words and wait an hour before testing you, you would be more likely to remember the word light than any other word on the list. And it never happened. Such is the way memory works. Memory is all about activating areas of the brain, and when you actually then recall, what you're doing is scanning through all the possibilities and looking for what areas of the brain are maximally associated, what have been maximally activated, and that becomes your memory. This is fundamental to the way it works. And it has a lot to do with kind of the way we invent our memories. An anecdotal example. So when I taught in Hungary for a while, and I remember I went to a dinner party once. And there was a high school teacher there, and he was complaining in Budapest that they were having a growing gun problem in Budapest. And I'm from Detroit, and I commiserated, and I said, you know, in my high school, we had to have metal detectors at all the doors. And I could still see the look on his face. He was very confused. He said, sir, why did you have metal detectors? And I said, well, the weapons, the knives, and the guns that our children bring to school with them. And he looked at me with this extraordinary expression and said, oh, sir, in Budapest, we have a growing gum problem. Our children, they're bringing gum to school and chewing it. Well, that was it gave a real reflection of the magnitude of the problems we have in the States. So I've told that story many times, and it's only recently, I've been keeping a diary almost every day now, I guess 33, 34 years. And I went back, and I discovered something really interesting, because I happened on that date. And the story is actually a little different than the way I remember it, and the way I've been telling it lately. In fact, just small differences. For example, I wasn't at the party. My colleague was at the party and told me the story. Apparently, over the years, in my retelling of the story, I've kind of moved myself. It's better to tell it in the first person, right? But what's really interesting is I remember that dinner party. I know what we ate. I know the look on that guy's face. To this day, I can see the look on that guy's face, and it never happened. That's the way memory works. You create it, you the technical word we use in psychology is confabulate your memory. You pull together things that seem to make the most sense, and you create your best story that you tell yourself and that you tell other people. And this is fundamental to the way that memory actually works. We are not acting like a computer. We are not bringing in a data storage and associating and making correct connections and tree diagrams. It doesn't work that way at all. Much fuzzier. And that's good news when you understand it and you start teaching to the way the people's strengths, the way the brain actually operates. And when you start teaching to the way the brain actually operates, teaching can be far more effective. And I'll give you a whole bunch of examples of what we call brain-compatible teaching. And then it's only useful if you can actually say, well, gee, I'm delivering continuing education credits. How can I make my courses more compelling and more useful? It's my job to be able to give you examples of how to actually change your materials and change your approach, whether they're online, whether they're live. How can you do it better so that people learn and retain the stuff better? This whole confabulated memory. No, not going so good. Not at all. Oh my. Might bring somebody back to mind. Anybody recognize him? As you may recall, Brian had a small problem on NBC, and he was recalling the time when he was embedded during Desert Storm and his helicopter was shot at. Sometimes it was not just shot at, it was actually brought down. And he ended up losing his job over that because it turns out after he related that on network television, some of the people who were in the same helicopter contacted the news and said, he's making it up. It's not true. Now, there's two different interpretations. One, you could say he lied. But I don't buy it. I mean, you don't get on. He's a bright guy. He knows he's exposed to the media. I don't think he just made that up. I think what happened was, over time, he confabulated. And these people, they're being interviewed all the time. They're continually telling stories. And the story kept getting a little bigger and a little bigger, and he kept moving into first position, and he started to believe it. And so we almost need a new word that's not lying, but it is the nature of the way our memory works that we create and we construct and we confabulate. And it has enormous potential for risks. People remember if you are at the scene of a car accident or if you are at the scene of a holdup, what you remember has as much to do with your own expectations and biases. It has as much to do with that as it has to do with what actually happened. The eyewitness testimony stuff, and we do this demonstration 100 different ways, is so incredibly unreliable and is so easily manipulated. For example, two quick examples. Both of these were done by one of my favorite colleagues, Elizabeth Loftus. Elizabeth took a 7-year-old boy and asked him, working with the parents and so forth, it was all above board. She asked the little boy, hey, she had the parents ask him, do you remember the time you were lost at the mall? Kid says, no. Oh, really? Oh, you were a pretty little kid, and you don't remember that time you were lost? He was never lost at the mall. You remember? No, I don't remember it at all. Okay. Come back 2 years later. Ask Billy again. Billy, do you remember the time you were lost at the mall? Oh, yeah, I was so scared. I was pretty little, but I remember I couldn't find you, and I was crying really hard, and a man I think he had a big beard and a red flannel shirt, and he was really nice, and he bought me a hot dog, and I heard my name announced over the speaker, and then you guys came and got me. Okay? Never happened. But what the parents can tell us is, Billy once went to a baseball game, and the guy sitting next to him had a red flannel shirt, and the guy bought him a hot dog at a baseball game. And He remembered a whole series of time when he was at, I think it was a Chuck E. Cheese, and he heard his name announced over the speaker and thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And what Billy has done is confabulated by bringing together all of these discrepant things, pieces of information, creating for himself a cohesive memory. And if you go on YouTube now, you can see a video of Billy swearing that the researcher's wrong and he really was lost in them all, because he has that real memory. Such is the way it works, and I'm spending the time on it now because it matters. Because it's going to fundamentally change the way we author and deliver training. When you understand it's all about activating brain areas and then your brain constructing those in creative ways, when you get that, it's going to change the way you approach the whole business. Are you guys able to control the you don't have a remote over this, so I got to do it this way. Okay. So, memory is encoded. When an event happens, it is encoded using spreading activation. The more activation, the more spreading activation, the more areas of the brain that are active, the more likely that is to be recalled, the more likely it is to transfer to actual behavior change. That's my premise. So we had to build that building block, and now we're going to go into specific examples of how to use it. By the way, the whole slide deck will be available. You'll see as we go through it. We're going to talk about follow-up training, and I'll make all these things available to you. All right, so we're not going to do 24 today. I think we'll get through, depending on the timing, 5 or 7 different brain-compatible teaching techniques, and that'll be the first half. So let's get to the first one. Deliver information to a pre-activated brain. Now, I said that having an activated brain, the more activated it is, the more likely you are to remember. So let's pre-activate the brain. Let me show you how that works. Deliver training to a pre-activated brain. Let's show you the difference when you teach in a brain-compatible way. Do not try to remember anything. Just relax. A type of car. Ford. Musician. Elvis Presley. A city. Detroit. A sport. Football. Type of candy. Snickers. A state. Colorado. Television star. Bart Simpson. Item of clothing. Socks. Color. Yellow. Kind of tree. Oak. A direction. South. Dinner food. Spaghetti. And then emotion. Jealousy. All right. I forgot. What was the type of candy I said? Snickers. Oh, that's right. The city? Detroit. Kind of tree? Oak. Dinner food? Spaghetti. Emotion? Jealousy. Type of car? I do this with my students. In a research setting, we can deliver 90 items. They remember 82, no rehearsing. No practicing, no effort. And the question is, wait a minute, why did... And this is really dramatic when you contrast it with, remember the first 15 words I read to you? Bulb and feather and all that, and there you are trying with all these mnemonics, trying to remember, trying to organize it, and so you can bring as many back as possible. With no effort, you can remember tons and tons of stuff. And I can tell you, I have presented actually just last week to a banking organization, and the woman who had seen me 2 years prior actually invited me, recited the list for me before the presentation, 2 years, no intervening reminders. And what's going on here is I am now teaching in a way that is compatible with the way the brain has evolved. And when you teach in ways that are compatible with the way the brain actually acquires information, we are incredibly smart. Conversely, when you teach in ways that are convenient for the teacher, when you teach using traditional approaches, people can seem not very bright. We don't learn, we don't retain. So of course what we do is we blame them. But the fact is we're not teaching in ways that are consistent with the way our brain has evolved. And when you teach in ways that are consistent with it, we can retain tons of information. Let's go back and talk about the physiology of why does this work so well? And the answer is associated, it will surprise you really. Some of you, again, people who've had a psychology class, you'll remember a Russian physiologist, first one to yell out the name wins a Nobel Prize in physiology, works with dogs. Pavlov. He was actually a physiologist studying digestion. And for those of you who don't know the story of Pavlov, what he did was he was trying to figure out how dogs digest food. But the dogs, after a little while in the laboratory, he would every time the trainer, he wanted to see how the dog, he'd put food in their mouth and he'd open up their stomach and he could observe the stomach through a fistula. But the dogs would begin digesting the food even before they ate. When the trainer was just walking into the room with the food in a bowl, the dogs would begin the digestive process. And Pavlov did the research to find out what's going on. And it turned out he would ring a bell, put food in the dog's mouth, the dog would salivate. Ring a bell, food in the mouth, the dog would salivate. Eventually, anytime he rang the bell, the dog would salivate. It's called classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning. And it's what's important about it, and what we know today is we have evolved as a species such that we can become sensitized. Certain stimuli, when they're presented to us, our brain becomes extraordinarily sensitized to what follows. In Pavlov's case, ring a bell, deliver food. When you ring the bell, the brain became highly sensitized and can absorb whatever's coming in at that moment. I'm leveraging that here. I'm leveraging exactly that technology here, and what I'm doing is, by presenting a word like a kind of tree, I am pre-activating your brain. All of a sudden, when I say a type of tree, a whole bunch of things go on in your head. And you might think of pines and oaks and all the different options, and then you kind of wait to see, what's he going to say? He said, oh, it's oak. A TV star. All kinds of things go through your mind. And when you see what I'm doing is by presenting the stimulus, I'm causing your brain to become actively engaged. You are thinking of things in all different parts of your brain. If we were to do a brain scan, we'd see by asking this question in the way, I am causing your brain to become highly activated, and so when I give an answer, it just sticks. Conversely, if I simply read a list to you and force you to process it, you to do all the work, your brain is not pre-activated, things don't stick. So how does this then translate? That may just be, yeah, okay, good. You can use this in your training. A simple technique would be, when you're talking to a group of students, group of learners, you want to be able to make sure that when you give important information, that they are already engaged and pre-processing. For example, in my classes, I always ask questions of my students. Rhetorical questions. What do you think? We're doing a thing on consensus leadership. What do you think is the best time to use consensus leadership with your family? Under what circumstances do you think we should use consensus leadership with your family? And I want my learners thinking about it. And what I do at the university as a technique, because I might ask that question rhetorically, but people can kind of slouch a little bit and not really think about it. So what I do in a live presentation, especially with my university students, is on first day of class, I'll be talking about consensus leadership, and I'll look around the audience for a bright-looking person, one of my kids, and I'll say, what do you think? What do you think is the best strategy? Now, I selected a student. It looks like at random, but I always pick a bright-looking, engaged person, and they want to ask them a question. And I get an answer. I never embarrass anybody. But you know what? When you ask a question that way of an audience, it changes the relationship to that audience immediately. People suddenly, the posture changes in the room. My students realize that at any moment, they might get the next question. And the posture changes. Then I've got their attention. So what I need is to have their attention so that I can engage and pre-activate their brain. And when I'm teaching, I know things will encode dramatically better if I can provoke thoughts in their brain in the moments just prior to key information that you're going to deliver. Quick questions on this. Are there questions about it? I've got to make sure this is a little bit subtle. Are there questions? It's a lot more fun if people ask me questions. We're going to use the other. Yes, thank you so much.
We're trying to send all the questions to conference.io, and then I can read them to you.
Perfect. But do you have a question for me?
I have the questions here.
Do it. Go ahead. Come on. What the heck?
Turn the mic on.
Cool.
Hello.
Hello.
So the first question is, have you ever been asked to appear in court to debunk a memory of a witness? It's not exactly related to...
No.
But
Okay,
it was,
so this goes back. This goes back to the first. It's a really good question, and you know what? At any time you want, if you see one that you really like that's immediately relevant, just kind of wave at me, and I'll stop. That's a good question. So this goes back to the stuff on confabulated memory and the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. I actually do work in the legal profession, but I don't do that. It's a conflict. So my best friend is Dan Riesberg, is one of the main people who will go into courts now, and our basic position in the discipline is to say, when we testify, all we really say, the best thing we can say is eyewitness testimony is not as reliable and foolproof as we might think. Did the event actually happen the way the person says it did? We don't know. Maybe. We know it could be confabulated, and so we can't say what did or did not happen. What we can say is that eyewitness testimony is far more malleable than you might like it to be. Go.
have you ever been asked to, from a prosecutor's viewpoint, the sooner you take a case to trial, the more accurate the witness testimony will be? Is that what you're saying?
Say that. The last part.
From a prosecutor's viewpoint, the sooner you take a case to trial, the more accurate the witness testimony will be.
You know, there's really good, this is an example of the kind of thing that you can do in terms of forensic testimony and so forth. Okay, show a video of a car accident to a group of students. Show them a video. It's two cars colliding with each other. Afterwards, you're going to ask all the students how fast were the cars going. All right? But I'm going to ask it differently of the two groups. I'm going to split them in half. Half the students, I'm going to ask them how fast were the cars going when they ran into each other. The other half, I'm going to ask how fast were the cars going when they crashed into each other. The average estimate of when you ask the question, how fast were they going when they ran into each other, was 15 miles an hour. How fast were they going when they crashed into each other? Estimated at 25 miles an hour. Furthermore, those two groups diverge. And it's not just their reporting, but the memory they actually have. Cool. The memory they actually have changes over time. And they remember it, thank you, far more dramatically when the question was asked of them how fast were they going when they crashed into each other. That suddenly becomes a big car accident, and if you ask them again after 2 years, their memory is profoundly different than the memory of the people you asked how fast were they going when they were collided. That's how malleable we are. That's how easy it is to manipulate a person's memory. And in that context, and so in the court, you try to tell the story to a jury about how easy it is to influence memories. Whether that memory is, remember that big case in California where the people, it was alleged child abuse at a daycare center. And psychologists played a large role in that, talking about how easily all of that could be confabulated, and it may be that nothing ever happened there. It just sort of took on a life of its own. Was there a question over there? Somebody? No? You have one more. Okay.
During a short learning activity, 1 hour, how much time should be spent pre-activating the learners and reinforcing information versus cramming 60 minutes of new information?
We'll be talking. So the question was, how much time should we spend in? I'm going to give you a toolbox today, a toolbox of training techniques, of approaches. The reinforcement stuff, I'm going to spend a whole 45 minutes on it. But I'll be giving you a toolbox, and you guys can decide for yourself how best to balance more content. So I'm not asking specifically that you deliver less content or more. I'm trying to say deliver that content in ways that are compatible with the way the brain will remember it. All right. So the first lesson, deliver information to a pre-activated brain. Ask rhetorical questions. When you do it, you can feel for yourself how dramatically different it is, how much better memory is. I can ask you a question now, a musician, a direction, item of clothing, it's all there. No effort. When you teach in brain-compatible ways, things stick. So let's look at some other examples. Technique 2, create training which leverages the brain's special ability to remember stories. Here's my demonstration. Okay, I need you to, excuse me, remember these letters for me. It's hard, isn't it? It's really, really hard. And the reason it's so darn hard, your brain did not evolve to remember a bunch of independent, discrete facts. That's not, as an organism, that's not how we've evolved. We've evolved instead to remember. The whole frontal lobe seems to have evolved to moderate social interactions and stories and scenarios. Humans are extraordinarily good at remembering it. People used to memorize all of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They memorized it because they're stories. They memorized the Bible. It's a series of stories, and people are extraordinarily good at that. And so what we need to be able to do is, when we have to teach discrepant facts, we have to turn them into stories. For example, with a little bit of reorganization, I've changed these independent letters into a series of acronyms. The FBI, the NBA, and IBM, HIPAA, OSHA. In fact, I can take those 7 or so acronyms and turn them into a single story. Where, for example, the FBI is investigating the NBA and IBM for HIPAA and OSHA violations. One sentence, super easy to remember, 15 facts. Now, Michelin, I work with Michelin. They need to train, they're very frustrated, their employees can't, there's 11 steps in demonstrating the symmetry of a radial tire. And you know what? Their employees can't keep them in mind. And they complain. And I said, that's not their responsibility. People don't do that well. We need to create a story. And it is incumbent upon you as a teacher to figure out ways to do that effectively. Teaching is an aerobic sport. You bust your butt to teach effectively. I love teaching. It's an honor. It's a privilege to be an instructor. But you know what? It's work. So I cut my training, my undergraduate training was with a psychologist named B.F. Skinner. And some of you have heard of Fred Skinner. Fantastic psychologist, amazing human being. Skinner his paradigm was we'd put animals, pigeons typically, inside of an environment, and then we'd turn on lights and change the environment and change the rewards, and we'd try to predict what the animal was going to do. And Skinner had theories of reinforcement, and his theories almost always predicted correctly what the pigeon was going to do. But you know, sometimes the pigeon didn't do what we expected. And I will always remember Skinner's answer to that. When the pigeon didn't do what his theory predicted, he said, "The pigeon's always right. I'm wrong." And I think teaching is like that. If our students aren't learning, if they're not retaining, and if they're not changing their behavior, it's our fault. My colleagues at the university are forever complaining that today's students are complacent or have a sense of entitlement. They're lazy, they're disengaged. And my answer to that is, maybe you're right. Now what? Those are our students. If they aren't engaged, if they're lazy, if they have a sense of entitlement, those are the people to whom we have to teach. So now what are we going to do? What are you going to do differently? How do you connect with those people? Teaching is an aerobic sport, and at the end of the day, it is incumbent upon us to find the ways to connect with them. And the new generation have different expectations. That's our job. We have to learn how to reach them. So when I'll give you an example. I was teaching at Duke, and I had to communicate neural propagation. What neural propagation is, if you prick your finger, an electrical signal is propagated along a neuron and the axon up through your arm, synapsing in the back of the spine. The process whereby neural signals are propagated is pretty complex. It involves chemical gradients, electrical gradients, a sodium-potassium pump, all kinds of things have to work together, and they work that fast in order for information to be sent. And you've got 100 billion neurons, so it's really important to understand, if you want to understand physiology in the brain, you kind of got to really understand how propagation works. And even my Duke students were struggling with it. So at first I blamed them for being disengaged. But I sat down one day, and there was a story in the paper at Duke, the Chronicle, talking about conflicts in a dormitory. And there was a woman's dormitory, and some guys were trying to sneak into the dormitory. Some girls were helping them. Some girls were trying to keep them out. The police, of course, were trying to throw them out. And I read the story, and I said, I'll be darned. That's what the neuron does. It's the same thing. And so I wrote a little allegory. And this allegory, and I'll make it available to you because it really serves a nice... The allegory was talking about the dormitory. Dormitory, those are the cell walls of the neuron. The girls inside, they're sodium. The boys outside, they're potassium. The sodium-potassium pump, that's the police throwing people out. And I wrote this simple allegory. And he tried to make it funny, and there was humor, and there's all these things. And it was a love story, and it went like 3 pages. The kids would read that, and they'd chuckle. And then, when they read about neural propagation, it was simple. It's exactly analogous. It's like what Orwell did with Animal Farm. You know, it's the story of the Russian Revolution. You tell a story which is analogous to the thing you want to communicate, and then and you do it in a language and with terminologies that are familiar and comfortable to your learner, then when you get back to doing the hard stuff, it's simple. But that's the work we have to do as instructors. That's what is incumbent upon us to work really hard, and if there's a new principle of accounting that's subtle, or if it's a new principle, a new approach, because as was being said before, there's new technologies out there, and our old school CPAs are pretty uncomfortable with it, it is incumbent upon us to figure out how we're going to communicate with those folks. And if you have a heterogeneous audience and you have some CPAs who are younger, you have some who are older and they have very different approaches, that's your job, is to figure out how can I create stories, scenarios that are familiar to the person, and I can leverage those to teach these new concepts. Because if they aren't learning, that's your job. And it's exciting. Question?
Yes. Do you have other ways to pre-activate the brain and gain attention other than singling a student out? I have not received good feedback on asking directed questions to people in class. Some people get nervous and shut down.
Okay. A few more words about that. When I'm working with a live audience, this goes back just a few minutes when I'm saying I call on people because I know when they're engaged, when they know they're going to be potentially called on, they are profoundly more their brain is activated. I can ask rhetorical questions. When I ask a question, everybody is trying to think of an answer because they might get called on, right? So everybody's busy thinking of what they're going to say if they get called on. It's different in a university environment because I do kind of the paper chase thing in my class, and we work really hard and we protect each other's egos, but you know what? We work our butts off and people know they're on the spot. That's the dynamic that I try to create in my classroom. It's harder in a one-off live session. My advice to you would be always make sure to you can tell who's paying attention, right? You know, you read your audience. Go for people who are going to make you look good. Go for people. Now, make it look like it's random, but that we'll call it. The second thing is, if a person struggles, cover them. Don't embarrass anybody. And so if a person really was, I was just answering a text from my kid there, no problem at all. That's fine. I get it. We'll talk to you. We'll ask you a question later. They say, okay, cool, thanks. And then I go to somebody else. But creating an expectation of engagement. By the way, this exact same thing, if you're delivering your training online, you can do exactly the same thing. We'll talk when we design online trainings, and I might have a video presenter. That video presenter is going to stop every couple of minutes and ask rhetorical questions of the learner. If anybody's interested, you can do it. So I'm real engaged with Google. You could push a YouTube video up. But now YouTube supports what's called cards, which are interactions. And you can actually push quiz questions into YouTube videos so that at 3 minutes and 18 seconds, the speaker, a quiz question comes up on the screen, and you ask a question of the people, right? And so I can do this kind of questions and answers because I want to pre-activate the learner's brain, even if they're doing something asynchronously online. And you can ask quiz questions or fill in the blanks and all kinds of this. You need to, sounds tacky, you need to control the learner's brain. You need to know when you arouse the brain, when you just lay back, because when you do that, you can pre-activate the brain at critical times. All right. Create training that leverages the brain's special ability to remember stories. It is absolutely reasonable. Now, we'll talk about emotions. We're going to talk about all the other things, what kind of stories and so forth. But even with CPAs, their brain will work better with stories and scenarios. And even with, in fact, I think more so with engineers and accountants. The engineers at Michelin do so much better. They're incredibly capable. The kids at Google are incredibly capable. But when you speak to them in ways that are compatible with their brain's bias towards scenarios, the comprehension becomes much, much, much better. And in turn, you're the specialists. You know if you have a new concept in debit side accounting, you guys are the content experts, or you have content experts on your team that can tell you, and you can ask them questions. This is really complicated. Is it sort of like this process? And then you can begin to form up. If If it's easy teaching, if you're teaching in ways that are super easy and convenient and it just comes out, it's probably going to be hard to learn. If you bust your butt and it's hard to teach it and organize it, then you can make it easy for your learner. The job is for you to put the elbow grease in early enough so that your learners, it's easy and obvious for them. And it just seems like, oh, this is clear, this is obvious, this isn't difficult at all. Well, doggone it, it's not difficult because me, the teacher, worked my butt off to find out ways to make it simple. And hopefully they'll never recognize how hard you've worked. But that's what makes hard teaching makes easy learning. Technique 3, provide context for new information. And for this one, we're going to actually divide, I think this is the demo I want to do. Yes. Good, it is. So what I'm going to do is divide the room in half. This is still working. Perfect. And so, right here, I'm drawing a line right here. And you're on this side. So this is, okay, you can be on either side. Perfect. If you are on this side of the room, keep your eyes open. Okay? If you're on that side of the room, I need you to close your eyes for a second. Close your eyes. Okay? Everybody look at this. If your eyes are open, look at the screen. And if your eyes are closed, you can now open them. So I'm going to do a simple demonstration here. You know, you'd think a guy who studies memory would remember where he puts his glasses. How hard is it? All right. So I'm just going to read a simple scenario for you, team, and I want you to bring this back to me. Pretty straightforward. So there'll be this is an important process. I need you to remember this. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to a lack of facilities, well, that's the next step. Otherwise, you're pretty well set. It's very important not to overdo things. If you have to go, of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to a lack of facilities, that's the next step. It's always better to do too few things at once than too many. In short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it'll just be another facet of life. It's difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task, but then one never knows. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will have to be repeated. However, this is just part of life. Pretty clear? Clear? Entirely, right? The sentences made sense. You knew how it all fit together. Pretty familiar, right? How'd you do? Pretty clear, sir? Looking away? Not clear. How long did you last before you began saying, this makes no sense? It's a really interesting thing because what you just experienced, you watch an audience, right? And you've seen it. I'll read a sentence, and it starts off innocuous enough. The procedure is actually quite simple. So everybody's got it. But then the next sentence doesn't seem to connect to the first sentence, and you say, oh, wait a minute. And that you see people dig in. They're gonna work harder. But then the third sentence goes in what seems to be a whole new direction. That's when the commitment changes to panic. And by the fourth sentence, which goes in apparently another new direction, people typically give up, and by the fifth sentence, people just say, I'm not going to listen, this makes no sense. But to them it did. To them it made perfect sense. This is a really interesting neuropsychological proof, and I don't know why it is, but the smart people always tend to sit to the right side of the instructor. Always the bright people, nah. The difference between the two groups, was a half-second exposure to a piece of context. The only difference between the two groups, they got a piece of context that you didn't, and that made the material opaque. You lacked the ability to link everything together because you lacked one single piece of information. And I'll show you what it was. That now, let me just quickly reread sections of this. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, 1 pound may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you go somewhere else due to a lack of facilities, that's the next step. Otherwise, you're pretty well set. Don't overdo things. Better to do too few things at once than too many. A mistake can be expensive. The procedure will seem complicated, and so on. Oh. You might say, why didn't you tell me that? That makes complete sense. But there's a reason, and I'm going to reverse this in a minute. I have an analogous experiment so that both sides of the room can feel this. This is the experience that our learners have sometimes. Our learners will be sitting in a live session or an online session or a webinar, and maybe they missed a moment, or maybe they don't know a vocabulary term that you assumed that they knew. And that single term, if they don't know it, or if they have a different understanding of it, your entire lecture is predicated on an understanding of that term, a common understanding of that term. And if they don't have it, they're lost. And typically, when I'm in a class, in front of a live audience, you can read people, right? And you start to see, all of a sudden, you see that intensity followed by panic, followed by disconnect. And when you get then among a lot of people, it's not their fault, it's yours. You've done something wrong, you missed something. And you got to work your butt off to understand your audience, what they do and do not know. I used to be I used to be a better professor. And I was a better professor because I understood my students better. I don't anymore. I don't know anything about pop culture. And I do know the new kind of the social media stuff because that's part of that. But my examples are less relevant to the kids today. And I think my vocabulary sometimes includes language that they're not familiar with. And I lose them a lot. My fault. And I've got to better do a better job knowing my audience. Let's flip this one around. If in the previous demonstration your eyes were open, close them. If your eyes were closed, leave them open. Okay? So go ahead. If your eyes were open, close them. Otherwise, leave them open. Everybody take a quick look at that. Everybody with their eyes open. All right. Just got a shorter passage here. Pretty easy. Okay? So please remember this. If the balloons popped, the sound would not be able to carry since everything would be too far from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on a steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would cause problems. Of course, the fellow could shout, but the human voice is not loud enough to carry that far. An additional problem is a string could break. Then there'd be no accompaniment to the message. It's clear the best situation would involve less distance. Then there'd be fewer problems. With face-to-face contact, the least number of things can go wrong. Got it? Okay, everybody can have their eyes open, or just take a nap. That's like, what? The second one, how did it come across for you?
Very unclear, but I'm picturing somebody in a room or someone stuck somewhere.
How much do you think you remember of that scenario? Of this, a lot of it get away from you? Yeah. It's really obscure. I don't know what's happening to my screen here. That's okay. You guys, was it clear? Perfectly clear. See, that they got smart on this side. Perfectly clear. you're missing one bit of information. That's what can happen to your learners if you haven't taken the time to pay attention to them. What do they know? And you have to practice your sessions. You got to be familiar with your audience. Very difficult when you have a heterogeneous audience. I had the privilege of teaching at Duke. I had the privilege of teaching at a non-selective, very low-level university. Both were great opportunities and easy to teach. I'm now teaching at a school which has outstanding students and has some badly underprepared students, all in the same classroom. That's really hard teaching. Holy baloney. When you have people with vastly different backgrounds, cultural, intellectual, teaching that, especially teaching neuroscience to the heterogeneous audience, creates an enormous challenge. All you can do is provide the prerequisite materials. And so when I bring an audience, this is a big part of what I do with organizations when I consult with organizations. How can you use assessments to determine what do people know and what do they not know? Because they bring people into a training seminar. So what we've come up with Target, the big department store. We have what we call the 25% rule when we're delivering training. 25% of the people who get to training don't need it. 25% of the people already know the material. 25% of the people need it but lack the prerequisite knowledge. And 25% of the people, it's perfect. And that's what's killing them. They're wasting enormous resources training when training is inappropriate to that particular person. And so within Google, we are developing very cool kind of assessment tools to determine what do the people know before the training. What do they need to know? What do they know? And then providing them with the background material. If there are things, critical pieces of information that they don't have, those have got to be immediately accessible to your learner. If you're delivering online training and you have technical terms or large verbs that people might not be familiar with, that's got to be hyperlinked. You have got to provide one-click access to difficult concepts and terms. People will ignore 98% of them, but boy, do you save yourself. And that 2% of the time when there's a term that they don't know and they can discreetly go click on it, what a blessing. So those are the kinds of, when pieces of information are missing, even a single piece of information can critically damage your training. Questions?
Yes. I have a burning question here. 11 people have upvoted this.
Oh my.
Do you think Brian Williams is a liar, confabulator, or something else?
I would love to talk to him. I bet I just think he's a confabulator. If I'm a betting man, I think he's too visible. He's not going to lie. He's not going to make it up. I think he actually believed it. That would be my guess, but I have no data for that.
Okay. So the next question, with the how much can you remember exercise, how much does the visual aid, questions displayed on screen, help people remember?
It depends. So the question is, how much do the questions on the screen help people to remember? Is that right?
Yes.
All right. First question, did they read it? Did they read the question on the screen and were they required to answer it? Could they ignore it? People will find, this is not rocket science to anybody, we all know this. People will find the shortest way to get through it. We all know that. It's a fundamental truth. It's what we all do. If we are required to do compliance training, the first thing you try is the next button. Everybody does it. Our learners do it, we do it. You find the shortest way to get finished. It is our job as educators to make the shortest way the way that guarantees that they learn something valuable. And the best way to get through the training materials that we design at Google is by learning it. And it is by actually comprehending, you can structure your quizzing, you can structure your feedback mechanisms so that engaging in the material turns out to be the fastest, most effective way to get through the material. So if I put a quiz question on the screen, does it help? Well, not if they can ignore it, they will. We did fabulous. We're doing ethics training and compliance training with Intel. They're right up in Portland, Oregon, where I am. And ours is just not boring. We just got done filming this. It was a great session. So this is the sexual harassment one. Guy walks into a building, and he walks in and says, "Hey, cutie," to the receptionist, and then goes in and sees a person he works with in the company, and they flirt like crazy. And it's all kinds of subtle, nuanced flirting and innuendo back and forth and so forth. And then we work with our audience, and we said, is this man guilty of sexual harassment? The correct legal answer is, in the conversation, the flirtatious conversation, probably not. And when he walked in the door to the receptionist and said, "Hello, cutie," that's sexual harassment. We create really ambiguous situations and then force the learner to engage with quiz questions and with discussions. And those are the kinds of things. So putting a quiz question on a screen by itself, does it help? Nah. No more than turning the screen blue. But if you force that question to be answered in a thoughtful way and you provide feedback and those answers are created, and that kind of engagement absolutely improves it. Go.
Yes. You've touched on this a little bit, but this is a top question. So how can we apply this knowledge of the brain and memory to instructional design?
Oh, that's all coming. If you don't know the answer to that, I have failed. So that's my job. Next step. Increase activation, brain activation, by adding appropriate emotion. I'm about to show you a video which made people at Boeing uncomfortable. So let that be up. See if I can do this right. Here. I think this is it. All right. I think memory is dramatically better if it engages emotions. So I want you to watch this video. I wish my company had made this. I think this is extraordinarily effective. When it's over, we'll talk about what's good about it. Sound is coming up, I hope.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rutherford Gray, and it's come to my attention that many women aren't checking regularly for breast cancer. I'd love to discuss how we can change that. But since studies have shown that women are more likely to watch a video if it features a hot guy, I'm not going to. He is.
Hey, I'm Anthony, and I'm here to talk to you about Rethink Breast Cancer's Your Man Reminder. It's an app that gives you regular reminders to check your breasts from a hot guy of your choice.
Hey there. How you doing? Hey, baby.
It also shows you how to check yourself. Hello. With a little something we like to call TLC. The T stands for touch. Start by touching your breast in any way that feels comfortable for you. Try to be familiar with them and the way that they feel. You know, you can do this anywhere, like on your bed, in the mirror, or even in the shower. Now the L in TLC stands for look. And for this one, you're gonna need to use your eyes. Be on the lookout for anything unusual. And if you want to, have a friend check you out. And finally, the C in TLC stands for check. If you notice anything out of the ordinary, even if you're not sure, check with your doctor. Isn't that right, doctor?
That's right, Anthony. You see, TLC is a great way to help detect breast cancer early. Download Rethink Breast Cancer's Your Man Reminder app today. Now available for free in the App Store.
All right. All right. Increase activation by adding appropriate emotion. What's the learning objective of that video? What are the learning objectives? The TLC technique, how to check. not at all. It's not it. Breast cancer awareness, nope. It's not the learning objective of that video. Remembering things, nope. Come on, really obvious. Download the app. The goal, the message, the behavioral goals of that video is not to provide education, it's not to provide training, it is to get people to download the app. Once you have downloaded the app, they will teach all those techniques, they will provide the reminders, they'll provide intervention strategies, all of those kind of really valuable things. That was not the learning objective of that video, though, to teach that stuff. That video was designed, I see a number of people downloading now. That video was designed to get people to download. And I want emotion. When you put emotion, when you put all these kind of innuendos and stuff, it activates the brain, and it's great. But it can be wrong, too. You got to put in appropriate emotion. I was just at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, okay? Saw a performance of Hamlet. It was okay, but the director did crazy things. Like there's a moment, if you know the play, when Ophelia is walking off stage and she's so distressed by what's happened in her world, and she's walking off stage and we know she's going to drown herself. And as she's walking off stage, the director had her totally disrobed. She walks off stage nude. Now, I'm not one to object to lovely ladies. It stopped the show. It utterly destroyed the theater that was so disruptive that it stopped the narrative of Hamlet. Why do that? The same kind of thing in all of our trainings. We have the ability in training to, if it's online, you can bring the question on screen, you can make it tumble on the screen, it can roll onto the screen and tumble. Why are you doing that? Stop it. That's distracting. That's what we call technically cognitive load. It contributes nothing to the message, but instead it simply gives me one more thing to ignore, and it just shows off you know how to use that particular technique in Captivate. It's baloney. Stop that. And if the message here, in this video, if the message were to teach the TLC technique, there are better ways that these attractive men flexing themselves are distracting from if the goal was to teach TLC, then I would say that video is misguided. But that's not the behavioral goal that they're looking for. The behavioral goal is download the app. And for that, I think the emotion pushed into that video is absolutely brilliant and effective. So it is incumbent on you. I will encourage you always to add appropriate emotion. You will increase activation, but it's got to contribute. You can't. So I'm with the Google thing, we've hired an outside agency to write all of our quizzing and assessment. And it's a very high-priced marketing team. And they come in, and so I've been training them. It's really hard to learn. I'll talk about boosting and reinforcement in a little while. How rude of me, sorry. So we hired up a pretty high-end advertising firm in the assessment and boosting, reinforcement, and so forth. And they wrote a series of reinforcements, and they included a series of jokes in there were really funny. And I said, why did you tell this joke? And they said, well, don't you like humor? I said, love it. Well, you said put emotion. This joke is not germane. It's not, teaching is a serious business. We want people to learn things and retain it and make their lives better and more effective. That's our job. We're not stand-up comedians. If that joke contributes to the learning objective, if a piece of creativity contributes to the learning objective, it's absolutely appropriate. If it's for your own engagement to show how clever you are, stop it. That's an indulgence that you're not allowed. We are in a serious business of teaching. Spend your time instead finding fun things that are funny and clever that contribute to the mission. And I would, if I had a chance to whack that director who directed, because it's Hamlet, stop it. Don't do that. That hurts the show. We have the same responsibility as teachers. Questions?
Yes. Okay.
Yep.
If you see a question that you agree with and you think it's important and you want it to go to the top of the list, you can click on the number on the left to get it to go to the top.
I'm going to be very interested to get feedback from you guys, what you think of this. As a speaker, I'll be interested to see whether you, because ultimately your experience with this tool is more important than mine. What I find as a speaker is there's a latency. And so by the time I hear the question, it deals with the topic I was talking about several minutes ago. And I find that disruptive. I'm not complaining, we're all educators here. I find that disruptive to the narrative. And I would see people also going back and spending time and looking at quiz questions where I want them with me. And I would solicit. So anyway, I mean, we're all here to learn from each other and from the experience. So question for me.
Okay, so at the top of the question list, in your example, do some memorization techniques tend to work better on some generations better than others, for example?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I mean, the brain stuff is consistent. I'm trying to give you global things that refer to the way the brains work. I mean, pre-activation works with any generation, everybody. Certain things work better with different audiences. And you guys, my experience working with your audience is you're more similar to the engineers. The last thing I'll talk about, when I talk about boosting, will work like crazy for you guys. And I'll talk. So there's a great deal of diversity. It's a toolbox that I'm proposing to you, a way of thinking. Excuse me. And you can use that toolbox in ways, experiment with it. Try the different techniques.
So some people need to see the slide picture that half of the audience missed.
So half my audience is, okay, the last time I went through that scenario, right, and I read if the balloons popped, the voice, well, it creates a real problem because, and I showed a picture to half the audience which made that scenario make complete sense. Here's the problem. We know from all the research that when a person, when you see a magic trick and it's awesome, and then the magician shows you how he or she did it, it takes all the fun out of it, right? And you forget it. It's when you don't know how it was done. And so if I want people to actually remember that demonstration, I shouldn't show that picture, and then it creates a cognitive dissonance, and it will stick. It's really true. If you resolve all of those kinds of conflicts for people, but heck, am I nice? Let's go back. I'll show you quickly. If the balloon popped, I don't remember the scenario, but the sound wouldn't be able to carry because the voice can't carry that far. If there was a break in the wire, it would break the electrode, then there'd be the message. Of course, the fellow could shout, but the human voice doesn't carry that far. You remember it, huh? Face-to-face is best. Good memory. People are incredibly good at remembering stories, provided you provide all the contextual information they need to have it make sense. Thank you, that was great.
Can our dreams create a real memory?
Say again?
Can our dreams create a real memory?
Great question, and the question goes back. All right, I'm just going to relax. We get through what we get through. I'm sitting here with this huge agenda, and what I should be doing is having a relationship and sharing my love for this stuff, because this is sort of a tangent, but heck, it's what happens when you dream is not qualitatively different than when you're awake. Your brain creates random collections of neural firings. You're sleeping, okay? And outside is a cat is walking and knocks over a garbage can. I should say, by the way, you're sleeping, your head's cocked to one side. This is relevant. Outside, a cat knocks over a garbage can. I should tell you, earlier in the day, you had an argument with your spouse. Cat knocks over a garbage can. A few minutes later, a police car goes by with a siren on. All this happens while you're asleep. But you know what? All of that information is still being processed by your brain when you're sleeping. Everything is processed. Your brain brings it all in and processes it. And what it does is it's got to make sense out of all of that information. And so what it does is it turns it into a story. And we call that story a dream. And so one of the things you might dream is that you are, so it's going to bring in information. You're processing things from your hippocampus. Is bringing back this argument you had with your spouse. And then it's got to, so you're recalling that, so you're remembering that, and that gets woven into the dream. Then the fact is your head is cocked to one side, right? Your brain gets that information because the proprioceptive information in your two ears are signaling the brain that it's not symmetrical. And we interpret that, if you have dreams of falling, always when people dream that they're falling, when you wake them up, you only dream that you're falling if your head is askew when you're sleeping. If your head is symmetrical, you don't dream you're falling because your brain makes sense of it. So maybe what happens is you're having an argument with your spouse, and all of a sudden, the cat knocks over the garbage can. There's a huge crash, and you begin to fall. And then the police come by, because all of these events that happen in real time, your brain is taking all these random pieces of information and turning it into a storyline. It might be a crazy storyline, but that's your brain's job, is to take discrepant facts and turn them into a memorable scenario. And it does it when you're awake, and it does it while you're sleeping. So it's a good question, because it really gets to this whole concept of confabulated memory. That's how memory works. All right, we'll do this last technique, and then we'll get to the reinforcement stuff. This thing really matters. And I'll tell you some of the research that I did when I was at Duke. We were always nice to the cats. I can promise you that. So for the cat lovers in the group, we were all very nice to the cats. Here's the way the experiment worked. Step one, a group of newborn kittens were raised in near darkness. They spent the first months of their life in basically darkness, near darkness. So they had no visual experience, kittens. Once a day for 5 days, we took the kittens out of darkness and placed them into this apparatus. The kitten on the right can walk around the room, and he can walk, and walking in a counterclockwise position, and as she does, she can see, he sees the changes in the wall, right? The cat on the left side, she is called a yoked control. She has exactly the same visual experience. She sees the same walls at the same rate, but she doesn't actually move the carriage. It's the boy kitty on the right. He's actually moving the carriage. The female is just riding along in this carriage next to it. But they have exactly the same, the two animals have exactly the same visual experience, and it's only like 10 minutes, 5 times in a week. So they get 10 minutes, 5 different times. And then what we're going to do in step 3 is test their visual abilities as adult cats. So we're going to check their visual ability as adults. What happened? What ended up happening between the two groups? Ask rhetorical questions, engage learners, pre-activate their brain. What happened to the cat, to the two groups? Any guesses? Question, what do you think happened? What's your name? Yeah. Robin, what do you think? Any guesses? Oh, really? All right. We're going to test for visual abilities. Yes, sir.
My guess is the cat that actually moved and their recollection.
And it turns out to not be recollection. It turns out that the kitten who is walking, when tested as an adult, has absolutely normal vision. That's from only 10 minutes a day for 5 days, normal vision. The cat in the carriage, as an adult, is blind. Utterly blind. And it turns out the earliest research in the area showed that if you have no visual experience in the early days of life, what happens is this is your visual cortex. This is where visual information is developed. If those areas of the brain are not stimulated during the first days of life, if areas of the brain are not stimulated, the brain seems to say, those areas aren't being used, allow them to die. It's neural death. We call it neural Darwinism. If neurons are not stimulated, let them die. So if an organism has no visual stimulation during the first days of life, the visual cortex dies away, and the organism is thereafter blind. But it turned out, in the follow-up research that we did, it was more subtle than that. It wasn't just visual experience while you're a kitten. It was interactive visual experience. It's not enough just to see things in the visual world. You have to be the one that's controlling the vision. You have to be the one that's moving your head and is moving in space, changing the visual input. That interactive experience is what causes the brain to learn how to see. Exactly the same kind of thing goes on in teaching in general. We have to have interactive experience. Our behavior has to change the stimulus in some way. When it does, when we are legitimately interacting with the environment around us, then we learn like crazy. We're very good at it. When we are put in the role of a passive learner, where we're not doing anything interactive, where my behavior doesn't change that presentation at all, people go passive and they don't learn. And I love training with video. But you know what? The downside, it gives you lilt, it gives you enthusiasm, it gives you humanity, but it makes the learner passive. And we have to find ways, and if anybody's interested, I'm going to meet with folks over lunch, I can meet with folks this evening. You gotta find ways to take whatever training mechanism you're using to make it so that the learner can actually interact with the material. Let's look at an example that was built for Google, and the way we evolved it over time to make it better. And the focus of this is, how do you make interactive training? How do you make training interactive? So the idea was to teach people how to use Google Drive. It's a new part of the Google suite of products, which is free, and it does everything that Microsoft Office does, except it's free. And so here's the training that was originally developed for it. Google Drive. Hit the next button, the ever-present next button. And then it gives you Google Drive as a file storage, good text, very well written. You're supposed to read that page, then you read this page. Here's how to access it. It provides uploading a file to Google Drive. It's all there. People, next, next, next. So that wasn't good enough. I said, improve it. I need it interactive. I need it engaging. I need it challenging. So they came with a second iteration, which is somewhat better. See what you think.
Google Drive is a file storage and synchronization service that will allow you to store and edit files from anywhere and from just about any type of device. You can collaborate with team members and edit documents, spreadsheets, and presentations in real time. During this interactive simulation, you will learn how to access Google Drive, how to upload a file, and how to share a file with a team member. Click Continue to begin the simulation. To access Google Drive, click the Google Apps icon and then click Drive.
Oh, okay. The Google app, click there, and then click Drive. I can do that.
Welcome to the Google Drive homepage. To upload a file to Google Drive, click the New button in the upper left-hand corner and then choose File Upload.
Okay, click the New button, click File Upload.
The File Upload box will appear. Browse through your computer and select the document that you want to upload to your Google Drive and click Open.
Select this file, click Open.
The file writing and social work is now appearing under your Google Drive. Now that you have successfully uploaded a document to your Google Drive, you can now share it with your colleagues. Put your mouse over the document you want to share and left-click. Notice the Share with Others icon appears. This is the icon next to the I object with the plus symbol on its left side. Click the Share with Others icon. Click in the People text box and type the name or email address of the person who you want to share the document with and select their email address.
Is that right? Ah, okay. Choose. Okay.
To set permissions to this document for the persons you're sharing it with, click the drop-down menu next to Can Edit and select the appropriate option.
Can edit. Choose Can Edit.
Click Send. Your document has been shared with your colleague and you have been returned to the Google Drive homepage.
What's better, what's worse? What was better in that presentation, what was worse? Thank you.
It allows you to have that hands-on experience, so it's better because for people who learn like that, they actually get to do what they need to do.
What was wrong with it?
It didn't give you a whole lot of options, maybe. It was very directive. It didn't allow you to, like, you know, go off into another direction.
I would put it differently. I would say the problem was it didn't force you to think.
Well, and that's my, like, go off into other directions and think about, you know, the other things that are out there.
And so I don't want them to free form. I don't want them to think broadly about all kinds of things. I want them to think about how to share a file, but I want them to think about it. And that's what I think failed in that presentation. You could do it by look for the highlight and click on it. You could be utterly disengaged with the process and complete it. You gotta force people to think and engage. Consider the third iteration, which I get it took a long time with these people. I think it's better. See what you think.
Google Drive is a file storage and synchronization service that will allow you to store and edit files from anywhere and from just about any type of device. You can collaborate with team members and edit documents, spreadsheets, and presentations in real time. During this interactive simulation, you will learn how to access Google Drive, how to upload a file, and how to share a file with a team member. Click Continue to begin the simulation.
Continue.
To access Google Drive, click the Google Apps icon and then click Drive.
The Google Apps icon. Oh yeah, that's this thing. Okay, I gotta click the Google. There's a timer. Got it. Okay. Oh, then I gotta click Google Drive. I got a timer there. It's not telling me what to do. If I don't know what to do and it times out, it will prompt me. Show me. What do I do? Oh, okay. Click there.
Welcome to the Google Drive homepage. To upload a file to Google Drive, click the New button in the upper left-hand corner and then choose File Upload.
The New button in the upper left-hand corner. Where is it? Better show me. Oh, okay. Click there. File Upload. Now I'm starting to get the hang of it. I got to do the upload. So now I'm actually
The
uploading
File
a
Upload
file.
box will
You're getting the
appear.
idea.
Browse through your computer. Select the
You're getting the idea. It's obliging. It is forcing the kind of engagement, intellectual engagement in the content. At every step, you finish the task faster by engaging. And when you engage, guess what? You learn. On the other hand, when I allow you to become a passive consumer, more than happy to just click through it. The fastest way is the next button. You got to create your training such that the fastest, most efficient way to complete it is by engaging intellectually in the content. All right. I'm going to go. Time is going faster than I had hoped. So we are going to skip some of the brain. There's good stuff, but there's just endless. Because I really need to get to the single most important thing. Reload. And so the question that I have for you is this. let's say you attend a really good seminar in your company. This seminar is well designed, well presented, interesting, relevant, all those good things. How much of it do you remember the next day? How much do you remember? Good seminar, not a terrible one. What do you think? 20%. Other estimates, what do you remember after a day? 40? 4. So this is an empirical question. It's not, and it's been studied extensively in the literature. And it turns out, first started in 1895 by Hermann Ebbinghaus, who discovered the forgetting curve. And what we discovered is 70% of all training is forgotten within 24 hours. It's actually 50% in 1 hour, 70% in a day, 90% in a week. That is a disturbing number. If we are in the training business, that number should be profoundly concerning to you. And people forget precipitously. And what I'm going to do in the remaining time is to show you why the forgetting curve happens, but once you know why it happens, how can you overcome it? American companies spend $60 billion a year training their employees, and 70% of it's gone in a day, 90% in a week. What can we do? Why is it happening? What can we do? So the short answer, and the mantra that I will keep coming back to is this: what you do after training is more important than what you do during training. The underlying problem is a misunderstanding about how memory and forgetting work. Most people think that forgetting is the failure of memory. I didn't bring home the milk, dear. I'm sorry, my memory failed me again. In neuroscience, we do not think of forgetting as the failure of memory. Instead, we think that forgetting is adaptive. It is inevitable, it is necessary, and it's adaptive. You have to. Let me give you an example of why. What's your name? Charles. Where are you from? Okay. So you know you're staying at the hotel here. You know what room number you're in. Oh, okay. What hotel were you at prior to this one? DoubleTree. Where? Jackson. How long ago was that? Oh, that was this morning. What was the hotel before that? What room number are you in? At the Hampton. No idea. He doesn't know, and that's good. That's the way his memory is supposed to work. Because if he remembered what hotel room he was in the Hampton Inn, you know what? Tonight you might go to the wrong hotel room. What we do, we collect so much information. We live in this chaotically crazy busy world. We have so much information coming in, you can't possibly remember it. In fact, if you remembered everything, then old information begins interfering with the new stuff. It's called proactive interference, where old information you had corrupts your newer memories. So our brain, forgetting is not the brain failing us. Instead, forgetting is a natural, active, cognitive process. Our brain is actively ignoring things and throwing things out. It's supposed to. Your perceptual system does this all the time. Right now, you're getting sensory information coming from your left ankle. You haven't been paying attention to it, but your left ankle. But your brain's been ignoring it. So pay attention. Don't forget. Think about your left ankle. When is the last time you blinked? Have you blinked recently? Keep that in mind. Pay attention. Inhale. Have you inhaled recently? Don't forget about your ankle. How about those fans that have been blowing in the background? Hear them? Your brain is ignoring your ankle, your breathing, your blinking, and the fan, and that's good. You are evolved to not pay attention to every bit of sensory information. It makes complete sense to suppress certain kinds of information that are not salient to your task of the moment. That's the way your nervous system is supposed. It's not a failure of your nervous system that you're not paying attention to everything. That's called focus. In fact, there is a disease in which people are unable to selectively ignore things, where everything is equally salient. This disease has an onset of typically 1 to 2 years of age. It disproportionately affects boys. It disproportionately affects attractive boys. And it begins at age 1. And you have heard of this. What is the disease? Autism. Autism in an autistic child lacks the ability to selectively attend to one set of stimuli and ignore others. The net result, if you can imagine that then, if the sounds and the smells and the visual information and the tech, everything's equally important, it would be, if you had that problem, you would do exactly what autistic children do, which is withdraw. You might self-stimulate. This is called stimming. They self-stimulate, or they will hit themselves because they lack the ability to attend to one thing and ignore everything else. Same as in memory, actively suppressing memories is a necessary part of the process. The problem is, in forgetting, we throw away the baby with the bathwater. Our brain is there actively throwing stuff out because there's too much information, can't keep it all, so your brain's throwing it out, but there goes the baby. And you lose the important stuff. So the question we had to ask in neuroscience is, okay, if we think of forgetting as a natural and adaptive necessary process, how does the brain choose what it keeps and what it purges? What do you think? If you were the brain and you had, what algorithm does the brain use to determine what it keeps and what it purges? Yes, thank you.
Frequency.
What do you mean frequency? The number of times, that's close and wrong. So it's close though. So he was saying it's the number of times that you are exposed to that stimulus predicts, if you're exposed to it a number of times, you're more likely to remember it. It's close, but not it. Yes? Again? You know what? You would think. The answer, the suggestion was, you remember things you need. Well, sorta. But there's some pretty darn important things that we're teaching people that they're going to need, that I try to teach my child, that are pretty important. You know what? It just seems to go in and out. And even if he thinks it's important, he might not. So that's not the factor. That's not what does it. Yes?
Evokes emotion.
Emotion helps on the encoding side. So what I'm talking about, there's two different processes here. One is encoding, taking information from the outside world and putting it in your brain. That's encoding. The second part of the process is retrieving. What makes it likely so it stores and can come back? How do you keep it in there? Emotion helps for a more broadly activated, this is the brain compatible teaching. The more emotion is put into it, the more likely it is to be stored broadly. Doesn't mean it's going to be kept. How does the brain decide what to keep? Go. What do you mean?
By having things that come back and bring it from maybe a slightly different perspective, where that you're reinforcing the initial concept, but there's something else that helps to re-stimulate it from a
We'll get there. That's close. Yes, sir. One more. Yes, sir. Different what? Different from different angles. Multiple dimensions, creating a piece of information and encoding it from various dimensions helps the encoding, but it doesn't help it to be restored. It doesn't cause permanence. What really, in the busy world, what predicts what's kept, there's no time, is a simple, when I thought I had 2 hours, I said, oh my God, that's all the time in the world. And now I'm getting, because you guys are a good audience too, so now you get up here and you say, oh. Simple statement of how the brain decides what to keep is this. Use it or lose it. It's not the number of times something is presented to you. It's the number of times you make use of that piece of information in the hours and days after you learn it. And this is an incredibly powerful effect. if you learn a piece of information and make use of it in the hours and days after training, your brain says, oh, that was cool, you just made use of it. And your brain seems to meta-tag it as, oh, that was useful, keep it. Conversely, if you don't use it, your brain gradually says, never used it, and it becomes forgotten. This is pretty, let's say you're doing a training seminar, and you attend that seminar. It's very good stuff. It's really relevant. It's going to help you do business in a new and better way. Your company devoted 4 hours for you to go to the seminar. It was well presented. You said you walk out of it terrific. You liked it. You leave the seminar, you go back to your office, and oh my goodness, there's a stack of emails. Got to deal with those. You spend the rest of the day doing those emails because that's your job, and you got to get caught up. The next day, quarterly reports are due. So that takes 2 days, and you do all your quarterly reports. Now I got to do employee evaluations. Crap, I hate doing it. That takes another day. Then it's the weekend. Remember that seminar? No, you don't. Because 6, 7 days have gone by, you've not made any active retrievals of it. You haven't thought about it, you haven't used it. And what your brain says is, it might be needed, it might be emotional, it might be useful, but you haven't done anything with it. You haven't used the information, and therefore, your brain does exactly what it's been evolved to do, purge it. That is not your brain failing. That is instead your brain doing exactly what it should do if information is unused in the hours and days after acquisition, purging. So what you can do, this is a look at Ebbinghouse's original data. What can you do to try to guarantee that the information you want to have retained is retained? So what we're looking at here is the forgetting curve. On the left axis is amount of percentage retained. The x-axis are the days after training. And you can see, let's use this one over here, that after a single day, you're down to about 50%. Or 70% is lost after 1 day. However, if you provide a booster event, and I'll give you all the details of what we mean. If you provide a booster event in the hours and days after training, it effectively resets the forgetting curve. A booster event is anything which causes your learner to actively, effortfully recall. I won't give you a lot of technical terms, but this is one, effortful recall. A booster is an effortful recall where you go back and you have to think about it. What was that new technique that I could do in QuickBooks? What was that? And if you're forced to think about it, that causes a reset in the forgetting curve. In fact, if you provide a series of these boosts, these causing your learner to do an effortful recall in the hours and days after training, you can eliminate, close to eliminate, the forgetting curve. If your learner makes use of your content in the hours and days after training, you can eliminate the forgetting curve. Now, a couple of ways. The gold standard, the best way to do this is the employee goes back to their office after your training and their manager comes up and says, hey, Mary Lou, how was that training seminar? What good stuff did you learn? What would help us? What were some of the messages? Oh, how could we employ this? What do you think? That kind of conversation. And then you say, oh, Mary Ann, let's talk about this more tomorrow, too. This was really good. That sounds like a useful seminar. Let's make immediate use of it. That's gold. Because the person is being forced to think about, to actively engage with the material, effortfully, to actually work at it, to think about bringing it back. That will meta-tag it, and it will stay there. The problem with the manager solution is it typically doesn't happen. And the manager doesn't have the awareness or the time to kind of ask those questions to force it. You can do it using technology. For example, here's one we did with Verizon Wireless. We gave them training over some new product, and then we sent them a booster question. It shows up on their Verizon phone. Quiz for the day. According to training, the first step in consensus leadership is A, B, C, or D. Your learner has to go, now they just had a long lecture on this. What was it? It was, I think it's B. So they answer it on their phone, and they get immediate feedback. You're right, according to Albright, establishing trust is the first step and must come before authority or goal setting. Now, what just happened was that you forced your learner to make an effort to think back, to recall the information, to bring it back into their mind. It turns out to not matter if they get the answer right or wrong. If they get it right, terrific. If they get it wrong, provide them the right answer, just corrective feedback. Help them with corrective feedback. What's important is not right or wrong. What's important is that they're making an effort to engage with your content in the hours and days after training. If they don't engage it with your training in the hours and days after, it will be forgotten. Furthermore, I would argue if you provide training to your employees and you do nothing to reinforce it in the hours and days after training, if you provide great training and no follow-up, I suggest you are performing training malpractice. We know what happens to content that is unreinforced, that is unboosted. It is forgotten. And we are spending entire careers taking important information, restructuring it, trying to deliver it in brain-compatible ways. If we do not reinforce it, it will be forgotten. How dare we? What a waste. You have to, what you do after training is more important than what you do during training. And if you do nothing after training, it will be forgotten. Consider, we know this fact in every discipline except training. Little known fact, the Duke basketball team. Coach, before we're going to play Carolina, Coach gets the team together the week before, and he gives them a PowerPoint presentation where he explains to them how they're going to play a man-to-man defense against Carolina. And at the end of that lecture, he says, "Thank you for coming. I'll see you next week at the game." And they don't see each other for a week, and then they all get to the game and they play. No, of course not. What they do during that week is practice. You do reps. Because we know in sport, you have to practice with material in order to remember it, in order for it to become an, kind of a reflex for us. You practice, you do reps. Broadway show, really interesting. They do an opening, once you've casted the play, they do an initial read through, they block, tell everybody where to stand, and then they open. They go right to opening, no. It's called rehearse. Over and over and over. Do the reps, develop the relationships. We know it in every discipline. We know that you have to learn new skills, you practice or you rehearse. Not in what we do. Nah, we give them an hour session. And then nothing. And then we blame them when they forget. It's a fundamental misconstruing of who we're teaching. We're not teaching a computer that stores it in a database. We're storing it in a human brain whose job it is to purge unuseful information. And if you do not provide the learner with an opportunity to use that information in the hours and days after training, their brain will forget it. And it happens to you, it happens to me, it happens to absolutely everybody. That's the nature of forgetting, and it is incumbent upon us to figure out ways to sustain learning. If you are working for a company that is in your company's best interest to support the training, it takes relatively little time to do boosting. I got buckets of articles. I published strategies for doing it, how we're doing it, some white papers and so forth. All of those things will be shared with you. But to do nothing is malpractice. Doing anything is so much better than doing nothing. I will provide you with all kinds of scenarios again and white papers and strategies how you can do this. But even if you don't do it the optimal way, it doesn't matter. Doing anything is dramatically better than doing nothing, and it will provide long-term maximization for your company. If you're a vendor and you're delivering training to outside people, providing follow-up training, follow-up support, reinforcement, boosting, however you want to call it, will give you a differentiator that'll make your product different than the competitors. You bet. Lots of people go out and give lectures. Lots of people do training, but we support that training in the hours and days afterwards. Is that 2 minutes? So, if you join me for lunch and stuff, you could do this with quiz questions. Given that I have 2 minutes, we have data up. It's extraordinary, the effect, the change, the behavior change that you can produce. Let me ask you this. Yeah, we'll go down to that. This is all part of behavior change. We can do behavior change stuff. The take-home message is this: provide systematic after training to sustain memory and produce behavior change. The articles, and if you want to chat later, we can do that. The question that I have for you is this. 2 questions to finish. What kind of hypocrite would I be if I stood here and said, you're going to forget most of what you learn at seminars? You have a responsibility to follow up. You have a responsibility to reinforce it. Training malpractice, all that stuff I was preaching. And then to step off the stage. It's called hypocrisy. So if you want the feeling, what I do in every session that I do is it's about having a relationship with the learner in the hours and days after training. You gotta find a way to sustain, to reinforce the material, to interact with the material so that people retain it long term. If you wanna know what this feels like, I will boost this session. Just go to Boost Me. If you go to that website, you just give an email address, and first thing tomorrow morning, your first boost will appear on your cell phone. And I'll ask you a question about the content that I delivered today. What's remarkable about it, and I'll send one, it's not a marketing thing, it's nothing like that. I want you to feel what it's like to have your training boosted. And the net effect was you will remember this seminar better than any other. Not because it's delivered or the content's better, but because I sustained it in the hours and days, forcing effortful recall. It will dramatically enhance your long-term retention. And once you have felt it, what it's like, you will, I hope, feel inspired to try to leverage it within your training and your organization. I am out of time. Always breaks your heart. If you want to reach out to me personally, certainly feel free to do so. There's an email address down there. I'm around. Just at this point, I'm a full-time professor type and consultant. I love working with people. So I'm around at lunch, around at dinner. Look forward to talking with you. If there's questions, you can approach me during the break. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.